Martin Luther King Jr. once said that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of Christian America. Now, I want to be clear that he said this during a very different historical context, the Civil Rights era, when the United States was wrestling with its bleak history of anti-Black racism in a fight to enforce the constitutional rights of Black Americans. But here in the 21st century, this remains a simple statement of fact. Most religious congregations in the United States are comprised of one racial group. Some 85% of all religious congregations have a membership that's at least 80% of the same race. Now, sociologists use this 80-20 split to differentiate between monoracial and multiracial congregations. A multiracial congregation has a second racial group making up about 20% of their membership. Sociologists use this ratio for a couple of reasons. Number one, once you reach about 20% representation, you have much more influence on what goes on in that congregation. And number two, you're just simply much more mathematically likely to come across and befriend people of a second racial group. But it turns out that most religious groups are not multiracial by this definition. Just 12% of Protestant congregations are racially mixed, and some 25% of Catholic parishes. I wanted to see evidence of this on the ground, so I flew to the Bible Belt, USA, to Knoxville, Tennessee, to visit Dr. Tricia Bruce, an expert on the sociology of religion, congregations, and the changing landscape of religion in the United States. I'll cut to clips of this interview throughout this video, but you should check out the full interview on my second channel. We drove around Knoxville on a typical Sunday morning to see evidence of congregations divided along racial, ethnic, and economic lines. We saw a Vietnamese Catholic church, a congregation almost entirely comprised of Vietnamese families with services conducted in Vietnamese. We then discovered an Assemblies of God church in a strip mall, a congregation comprised mostly of Hispanic immigrants in the lower and working classes, with services all conducted in Spanish. Driving down a single road in Knoxville, we passed Seventh-day Adventists, a Jewish synagogue, an Eastern Orthodox church, and some religious buildings I couldn't even identify. But Knoxville is still pretty segregated both racially and geographically. Driving to the east side of town, we passed a dozen predominantly Black churches, all within a few square miles, including a big church built into an old warehouse. Now, we know that all religious congregations differ in name and doctrine. You have mosques for Muslims, gurdwaras for Sikhs, synagogues for Jews, wards for Latter-day Saints. But on the single drive around Knoxville, we can see that religious congregations are divided more than just by doctrine. But why is this? Why are religious groups so divided? These racial divisions reflect what sociologists call social boundaries. Those us and them groups that we create by hanging out with people similar to us, whether driven by how much money you make, how much education you have, or your racial group. Another way to describe gathering on the basis of similarity is homophily. The homophily principle states that the connections that we make with other people, whether around friendship or marriage or religion, are frequently structured by similarity. We befriend people similar to us. We marry people similar to us. And there's a few explanations for the homophily principle. Reason number one, the religious marketplace of the United States. Dr. Tricia Bruce argues that the context of the United States enables this flocking together.
Congregations run the gamut in the U.S. religious landscape, and we know that the context of the United States with regard to religious freedom means that congregations of all types can thrive, right? So one of the reasons that scholars point to is the fact that this context of freedom that allows so many congregations to flourish means that there are lots to choose from, right? Some even call this a religious marketplace. So if you have a marketplace of options, then it might be that you look for a place that has others like me. So this is one of the factors, right? You look at the landscape and say, what church do I want to go to? What congregation looks right for me? And you might look for one, hey, there are others who look like me there. So this is one of the reasons.
It's almost like supply-side economics. We can think of religious adherents as consumers with specific expectations and preferences, and the marketplace of options in the United States responds to meet that demand, enabling a flourishing of niche groups. Religious freedom policy in the US creates that level playing field where niche groups can proliferate. She writes in her book Parish and Place that American religion reacts responsively to the particular and changing needs of its consumers. And we saw this on our drive around Knoxville. If you are a Vietnamese Catholic family that speaks Vietnamese in the household, you might much more prefer to drive 45 minutes to the Vietnamese Catholic parish rather than drive 5 minutes down the road to the predominantly white and English-speaking Catholic parish in your own town. Because there's a marketplace of options in the United States, people can choose based on their own preferences. So even though this word divided has a very negative connotation, in some respects, the homophily principle seems to be based on choice. I asked Dr. Bruce about this. What I'm interested in is these terms divided and segregated. They have kind of a negative valence to them, especially with the history of the United States, with segregation and the civil rights movement, stuff like that. But what I hear you saying is these people are self-selecting in some respect. They're choosing to drive 40 minutes to go to their Vietnamese parish because they want to be with, they want to be in a congregation that speaks their language or their native language. So can you speak to this idea of the religious marketplace where people are choosing to self-select into these congregations?
Yeah, people are choosing. And in fact, the whole idea of a congregation is, again, especially within the context of religious freedom, it relies on voluntary association, right? So it means that people are choosing a place that feels like home to them. So this is not prescripted, this is not forced, but it does, the ways in which people choose reflect these sort of internal boundaries that people draw between us and them. And there's some, I think, differences too along denominational lines, and the extent to which one is allowed to choose or expected to choose or not. I mean, even, I study a lot about Catholics, and technically in the Catholic Church, it's based on this territorial parish system that actually does draw geographic boundaries that says, okay, all the Catholics in this neighborhood belong to this parish. But we know, again, based on that, especially that penchant for choice, is that a lot of Catholics, like a lot of other religious adherents, will say, oh, I'm going to drive by the congregation that is closest to me because I want to go somewhere else, right? So it is choice within this broader structure of how religious organizations work, how polity works, and how we think about lines between ourselves and others.
So the marketplace of options in the United States context is one of the drivers of this phenomenon. But personal choice is not boundless. There are systemic factors that shape who we associate with, and one of those major factors is socioeconomic class. Religious congregations often reflect their own neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are still segregated based along economic and racial lines.
Of course, in the context of Knoxville, as we saw on our drive around town, we see this around the country. Neighborhoods are still pretty segregated along racial and economic lines. So some of this is changing, but you see embedded in cities the kinds of social boundaries that emerge from, choosing one's neighborhood, or sometimes it comes across as choosing a school, or choosing an area that feels comfortable. Well, oftentimes that place that feels comfortable, that is accessible or affordable, is going to mirror those same kind of divisions. And if congregations are nestled into neighborhoods, then those congregations are going to reflect that kind of segregation that's already happening in neighborhoods. And in fact, some of the scholarship shows that congregations are even more divided than their neighborhood, meaning that sometimes they express an even higher level of segregation than the neighborhood that's surrounding. But the residents, the ecology of the neighborhood is going to matter a lot for what the congregation looks like.
You can still see this sort of division reflected among religious groups today. The General Social Survey shows us that religious groups can be ranked in order of social class. Liberal Protestants and Jews, for example, are more likely to describe themselves as members of the middle and upper classes, while Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics are much more likely to describe themselves as members of the lower and working classes. So to put it simply, the explanation for the homophily principle is way more complicated than personal choice. There are a lot of other social factors that constrain the marketplace of options. So what's the big deal? The thing about the homophily principle is that it has a lot of influence on society, and sometimes it has positive and negative effects. On the one hand, homophily can play an important role in affirming our personal identities, building networks, and empowering social movements. It can generate access to other kinds of social goods and social capital by surrounding yourself with the people you want to be around. So, for example, think about the important role of Black churches in the history of the United States. On the other hand, us and them social boundaries can very easily become us versus them social boundaries. Homophily can limit our imagination. It can prevent us from meeting people that are different from us. If we only hang out with people that share our economic standing or our same politics, it might be very difficult to empathize with other people and to make decisions that go beyond our narrow slice of the world. These are important considerations for the United States, being as religiously pluralistic as it is.
I mean, the reality is that these experiences have real ramifications for how we vote, for how we think of ourselves as civically engaged citizens, for the ways that we think about who belongs and who doesn't. And so religion has always been a powerful force in that. And the question is how, right? And what does that look like? And what are the potential strengths or limitations of religion in, if you want to say, overcoming certain boundaries or exacerbating certain boundaries versus amplifying them?
Like Dr. Bruce says, religion remains a powerful social force to this day. In the US, there are more religious congregations than there are franchises of the top 10 fast food restaurants. There are more religious congregations than every McDonald's, Subway, Pizza Hut, or Dunkin' Donuts combined. That adds up to some 384,000 religious congregations across the US. Roughly 36% of Americans attend weekly services. Remember this next time someone says that religion will be losing influence in the 21st century. I don't know what's going to happen 100 years from now, I'll admit that, but at least for the next 5 to 10 years, religious congregations will remain very important sites for political and cultural dynamism. But what can we expect? What can we expect from the next 5, 10 to 15 years? Well, I pitched the same question to Dr. Bruce. So this research speaks to our current political moment here in the United States, but it also speaks to the next 5, 10, 15 years, as the demographics of the United States change. So what does the future look like with this research?
Yeah, local religious organizations are a great place to look as a signal of what's to come and what's changing and what's not changing in terms of attitudes or demographic composition or otherwise. With regard to the racial composition of congregations, an increasing number of congregations are multiracial, and an increasing number of people who attend congregations are attending places that are multiracial, which means sometimes that means a super large congregation, which is going to be more likely potentially to have diversity on a variety of fronts. And sociologists have been measuring this for some time. And in fact, in measures even as recent as 10 years ago versus now, there are a higher and higher number of congregations that are reflecting internal diversity, so multiracial congregations. So this is changing over time. And I think we'll continue to move that direction.
The United States is becoming increasingly religiously pluralistic, and those religious congregations are becoming more multiracial. So here's where I make the pitch that we need more religious literacy education. For the Americans in the audience, it sounds like we'll need to be more religiously literate if we want to deal with these possible negative effects of the homophily principle. But if you want to dig deeper into this research, you should watch the full interview between me and Dr. Bruce on my second channel. I also want to say special thanks to Sacred Rights, an initiative at Northeastern University that's supporting scholars of religion to reach a broader audience. I wouldn't have been able to travel to Knoxville, for example, without their help. And also thanks to our patrons on Patreon that support the show. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Oh yeah, it's like they took over a gas station.
Oh wow, it's an old gas station.
Or probably this was an old grocery store or something that had a gas station. And then
just
the
with the sword and shield.
Took it over. There's not much active signage, so I don't know.
No, I don't know if it's even active. Eternal Life Harvest Center. I don't know what that is. Guess it sounds Christian.
Right. Yeah, it's a good guess around here.
Yeah.
God, we trust.
Oh yeah, look at that. It still has the fast gas sign on the side.
Right, yes.